The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. So hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast, and today we welcome back Tim Bouverie onto the podcast as part of our Chalke History Festival special series. And how are you doing, Tim?
Very well, thank you, Jackson. Thank you for having me.
No worries at all. Now today we're talking about your brand new book, Allies at War, The Politics of Defeating Hitler. It's an incredible book, I couldn't put it down, but I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to look at this topic?
Well, I think everyone is very familiar about the military events that led to the collapse of the Axis in 1945, but the diplomacy and the politics that led to that culmination is often overlooked, and particularly the difficulties within the alliance. For one thing, this alliance was not envisaged by anyone at the start of the war. The alliance that was meant to hold the Germans and defeat the Germans was the Anglo-French alliance, and that was the alliance which had preserved French sovereignty, British sovereignty, for 4 years between 1914 and 1918. And it is only because of the absolutely unforeseeable and shocking collapse of France in 6 weeks, in May, June 1940, that a whole series of diplomatic durations have to take place. And suddenly the British, for the first time, realized that they are absolutely reliant on the United States. It was one of the more surprising things I found in my research was that the British were not trying to bring the US into the war during the so-called phony war, that is September 1939 to May 1940. And then there is this other great factor which they have to consider in a new light, and that is Soviet Russia. So it's looking at all of the difficulties of this alliance, how different nations interacted with each other, and also looking at how, while at the same time these major powers were cooperating in the fight against Hitler, Mussolini, and the militarist governments of Imperial Japan, they were also rivals who were constantly looking over their shoulder, as it were, about the sort of world that would appear in the aftermath of the war and the balance of power thereof.
And I think the way that you look at the balancing between present and future within the book is incredibly interesting. And certainly in the way that Churchill approaches it. And he seems to have, or he does actually have, an incredible grasp on history. How does that kind of play into the way that Churchill approaches this historical moment?
It can be a curse, Churchill's sense of history, but it's also generally an asset. I mean a curse purely in the sense that Churchill is so aware that the events of 1940 are epoch-defining. Those 6 weeks in 1940 really are in many ways the hinge on which the rest of the 20th century swings. He's very aware of history, and he's very aware that history will write about this. He's very aware of Britain's sense of honour, and this leads him to make certain decisions with respect to the Battle of France, which are strategically unjustifiable. Not just throwing more fighter squadrons against the advice of the Chiefs of Staff and the Air Minister in London into the Battle of France, where 50% are being shot down every day, but also after the miracle of Dunkirk, where over 350,000 British, Commonwealth and French soldiers and sailors are rescued from France, he sends a fresh expeditionary force back to France, which really was a policy of just reinforcing failure, and it caused dismay among the British Chiefs of Staff. And one of them, General Ismay, says to Churchill, well, perhaps we might delay the embarkation of this new expeditionary force, because it is plain to Ismay, as it is plain to all of the British, apart from the Prime Minister, that France is beaten, and that France any day now will be suing for an armistice. And Churchill says, absolutely not. It would look very bad in history if we were to do such a thing. So he's thinking about posterity. That said, a general sense of history is an invaluable asset or a part of Churchill's makeup during this time. And one, just to take one example, would also revolve around the role of France. Churchill and the British government recognized General de Gaulle as the leader of a Free French fighting contingent in the summer of 1940, but de Gaulle is hardly known. They have no real idea who he is, and over the next few years, as I go into quite a lot of detail in the book, de Gaulle infuriates the British. He absolutely drives them up the wall. They believe that he may have fascist aspirations. He may want to become a French dictator. The Americans are even more exasperated, and the Americans, from Roosevelt down, continually press the British to break with de Gaulle at various moments during the Second World War. And however tempted Churchill is by this, however absolutely exasperating he finds de Gaulle, his sense of history tells him that European civilization and European security without a strong France is unviable, is completely inviable. France has an emotional place in Churchill's heart, but it also has a historic place. And I think Churchill's awareness of British history as connected to the continent of Europe is very important to his idea of the necessity of building up France. And at these various peace conferences, it is Churchill who absolutely insists that France must be made a great power, that France must be one of the occupying powers of Germany at the end of the Second World War, that France should get a seat on the United Nations Security Council, all of which happens. Not that there's been a huge amount of thanks from the French ever since for all of this that Churchill did for them, but I think that it's his sense of history that causes him to champion France against the American view, which is that France should never rise again. France is now a second, if not a third-rate power after the capitulation.
It's very interesting to see Churchill kind of harking back to that early modern balance of power idea within Europe. But then, that you have, after the fall of France, and you have the rise of Vichy France with alongside de Gaulle's Free France. How do the Allies, Churchill and particularly Roosevelt, deal with the balance of having two regimes there?
Well, it's a very curious phenomenon, Jackson, because they split. The Americans continue to recognize Vichy. The American recognition of Vichy continues until the moment that Vichy ceases to exist, until November 1942, when, following Operation Torch, when the Allies invade French North Africa, Hitler sends the Wehrmacht into southern France, into the unoccupied zone, and any pretense of an even partly independent French regime disappears. The American argument for continuing to recognize this collaborationist regime, which fully collaborated with the Germans in the Holocaust and bombed the British naval base at Gibraltar, fought against the British in the Middle East, in Syria, and in Lebanon, was that by recognizing the Pétain government, it gave the Pétain government something to lose. Their idea was the Vichy French will not collaborate to the full extent with the Germans if they feel that if they do that, we will break with them. But it doesn't really work like that. The Vichy French are completely in the German pocket, and the Roosevelt administration are, I'm afraid, fairly consistently naive about this fact. The British, on the other hand, are backing the Free French, and they are trying to use General de Gaulle and the Free French to wrest as much of the French Empire to the Allied side as possible. And this leads to several disasters, as I talk in my book, such as the Dakar expedition of September 1940, when a Free French contingent, supported by the Royal Navy, tried to take the Senegalese capital, as it now is, on the west coast of Africa, a complete disaster. And then some very, very vicious fighting, a 2-month war, which the British and the Gaullists fought against the Vichy French in Syria and Lebanon. And as Churchill commented at the time, if only the French had fought like this in 1940, we might not be in this problem. But they were determined to show the Vichy French that they were bold, that they were brave, that they were good fighters. They wanted to try and expunge the guilt of the armistice. They wanted to protect the French Empire. They hated the Gaullists, whom they thought were traitors and British mercenaries. And they hated the British because the British had sunk a large portion of the French fleet at Mers el Kabir off the North African coast on the 3rd of July, 1940.
And there's a lot of interesting strands in that answer I kind of want to pull on, but I think the most important one there is navy and naval strength. Now there seemed to be a lot of back and forth about what to do with the French navy before the French sign an armistice with the Germans. Why is that navy such a bone of contention? Why is it such an important thing for Churchill to begin trying to look for a solution on?
Well, in one sense, it's very simple. The French Navy is the second largest in Europe after the Royal Navy and considerably larger than the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. And as soon as it appears obvious that France is going out of the war, Britain is faced with the threat of invasion. And we all know about the Battle of Britain. We all know about the few that so much is owed to. But the RAF was the first line of defence in that sense, but the real defence against invasion was the Royal Navy and the ability to sink any German invasion force before it had reached Dover or Kent or wherever it might have been that the Germans decided to land in the event that they did land. The capture of the French fleet by the Germans, or the surrender of the French fleet by the Germans, would have tilted the balance to such an extent that an invasion seemed a viable option for the Germans. It wasn't really a viable option from a naval point of view in the summer of 1940, and then it seemed completely inviable by the fact that the RAF defeat the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. But negotiations about the French fleet begin before France has even gone out of the war. The British are asked by the French to release them from this treaty that the two countries have signed, which prescribes, that is, prohibits a separate peace. And after a lot of thinking about this, the British say that they will let the French sign a separate armistice with the Germans, but on one condition, and that is the condition that the French Navy is sailed away immediately to the British Isles. Now, then there's an element of confusion about this, because then the British get involved in this absolutely fantastical idea of an Anglo-French union, the idea that they're going to, both countries will surrender their sovereignty and become one country. And we could talk about that separately if you like. But thereafter, the issue of the French fleet becomes paramount. The French swear that they will never surrender the fleet. They promise that they will never do this. They say that they would rather scuttle it, that is, sink their own ships, than let it be taken over by the Germans. But to put it frankly, the British don't trust them. It's not just that they don't trust them in and of themselves, that they don't trust the French to not double-cross them, but they don't believe that it's necessarily will be in French power to take over the French ships. And in fact, when the 3rd of July 1940 comes, when this operation to sink the French fleet is enacted by the British, at that same point, that same day, there are various other operations against French ships which are in British ports, including submarines, and they are all taken over by the Royal Navy, and none of them are sunk. And the Royal Navy succeeds in capturing all of these French ships that are in British ports at that time. And Churchill pointed to that later and said, well, look, this is an indication of quite how easy it was to capture these ships. And that is why we took the drastic action we did. Now, it should be said that the French were given major options to avoid this catastrophe. Nobody wanted to sink the French fleet. The French were admiral on the spot in North Africa, Admiral Churchill, and as he communicated this message to his superior, Admiral Darlan, they were offered the chance to either send the force de raid, this is this portion of the French fleet, to British ports, where the ships would be impounded for the rest of the war and their crews repatriated to France. They could join the British and continue to fight the Germans. They could sail to the French Caribbean or to Canada or to North America, or they could scuttle the ships themselves. They could sink the ships. These were four honourable, viable options, and it was the refusal of the French naval authorities to consider any of these options that led to the British carrying out their threat and shelling the French fleet, sinking several ships, and killing or drowning, killing by shellfire or drowning thereafter over 3,000 French sailors.
Because reading that through the book, it felt like a really lost part of World War II history, where that attack is needed to happen. But then you were speaking about that Anglo-French Union, because I've seen that crop up a couple of times on social media around the Brexit referendum and afterwards. But what are the details of this actual proposed union? Because it's such a fascinating part of history we don't touch on with depth.
Well, there are no details at all. It's a completely mad idea that is pushed on Churchill by Jean Moulin and General de Gaulle, who has come over to Britain to see about using the Royal Navy to transport as much of the French army as possible to North Africa. De Gaulle says to Churchill that some big dramatic gesture is needed to keep France in the war. French morale, not least, if not primarily indeed, within the government is extremely low. The capitulades, the defeatists are in the ascendancy. Everyone is saying that France is beaten and that Britain will be beaten. What Churchill really wants to do is keep the French in the war, because if the French stay in the war, then the French Navy will continue to fight alongside the Royal Navy, and the French Empire, which is very considerable and strategically extremely important, will continue to support the Allied cause. So when de Gaulle suggests that there should be an Anglo-French union, Churchill goes to the War Cabinet, and the War Cabinet agree it straight away, and this offer is put through by telephone to the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud. There are no details. All it says is that, quite simply, Britain and France will cease to be independent countries and will become one country with one combined chiefs of staff and one pooled set of military, financial, material resources. What is so absolutely crazy about this is that for the last week, 10 days, is Churchill has finally started to refuse to send Britain's last remaining squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires over to France, because he realizes that they are absolutely essential if Britain is going to survive the next few months, and that the rate of losses of fighter pilots in France during the battle are just so high that nothing could be worse than to throw more fighter squadrons into the Battle of France. But if the French had accepted this plan, suddenly Britain has no sole authority or sovereignty, to use the correct term, no sovereignty over its own fighting forces. The French could say, we're one country, we must defend. Toulon is as important as Torquay, and you've got to send everything over because we're now one country. So it hadn't been thought through at all, and it was, thankfully, from a military perspective, for the reasons I've just outlined, rejected immediately by the French cabinet. They were so convinced that Britain was going to be defeated within a matter of weeks that Pétain's response to the offer was, why would we wish to fuse with a corpse?
And that quote was such a powerful quote, particularly when you look at what happens after there. But you mentioned the French colonies and the importance of the French Empire. And the colonies and empire seem to be incredibly important throughout this book, in the way that Churchill responds and thinks about them, in the way that Roosevelt thinks about them, and the way Stalin thinks about them. Why was it such a large and contentious area of discussion between the Allied leaders?
Well, there are two answers to that. Colonies are extremely important for where the colonies are for strategic reasons. This is the first truly global war. It makes the First World War look almost parochial by how global the Second World War is. And there are various Anglo-French colonies in extremely strategically sensitive parts of the world, primarily the Middle East, but also in the Far East. And a great fear that the British have in 1942, when the Germans are driving for the Caucasus in the Soviet Union, and the Japanese are running amok in Southeast Asia. They've conquered Burma. They're at the gates of India. There is this huge fear that there will be a union of a conjunction of the Axis in the Middle, or what used to be called the Near East, in Iran, that the Germans will manage to cut through from the Caucasus, the Japanese will come through India. And that is also the other reason why the British fight so hard and not always successfully, but why Egypt is considered so strategically important. The other fear is that there will be a conjunction coming across North Africa, and then the British will be pushed out of not just Egypt, but also Iraq and Iran. And Iraq and Iran are providing all of the oil that the British need for their Mediterranean operations and Middle Eastern operations. The Americans are actually providing all the oil, Britain's main oil main source of oil for the war, but it is Iran and Iraq that provide the oil necessary for Britain's Mediterranean and Middle Eastern campaigns. And this source of oil would have satisfied Hitler's needs as well. Why is Hitler going for the Caucasus? It's because he wants the oil fields of the Caucasus. On the other hand, the Allies are thinking about the post-war world. Roosevelt is very conscious of public opinion, and he is himself a great idealist. He is the political protege of Woodrow Wilson, who famously, during the First World War, developed this concept of self-determination, that people should have the right to decide their own future and independent of any imperial power. That was a cornerstone of Wilson's thinking, and it's absolutely the heart of Roosevelt's thinking too. And the Americans make it very clear from the beginning of the war, even before the Americans come into the war, that they are not going to help the British to maintain the British Empire. They are happy to help the British defeat Hitler, but they are not looking to maintain the British Empire. They're looking to dismantle it. One, for moral, political reasons. They don't believe in empires. They don't believe in colonies, even though it can more than be argued they have their own empire to a certain extent with Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and the whole may even be argued that the whole of North America was the result of an imperial land grab. But on the other hand, there is a less altruistic reason for this American interest in the British Empire, and that is that in those days, the British Empire was protected by a very robust set of tariffs. And the Americans in those days did not like tariffs. The Americans thought that tariffs were the scourge of prosperity and the cause of war. They led to increased international tensions. They led to decreased prosperity, further exacerbating international tensions. And it was the long-standing campaign throughout the 90s of Cordell Hull, the US Secretary of State, and the Roosevelt administration to dismantle global tariffs, in particular those that protected the British Empire, not least because the Americans realized that they, with their almost unlimited powers of credit and economic and financial resources, would be the ones who would benefit from the collapse of this protectionist system. They were going to be the ones that were going to be able to dominate these markets if they were free. If you are the world's most powerful economy, then free markets make an awful lot of sense because you are going to be top dog.
I think it's very interesting that we're having these debates, perhaps the other way round, 80, 90 years later. But then within Roosevelt's approach to empire, he seems to have a kind of naivety to it when he's looking at Stalin and perhaps Stalin's approach to a post-World War world. Why does he see Stalin in this almost idealistic way?
Roosevelt is an extremely complicated character. He's easily the most complicated of the three Allied war leaders. As I write in the book, I think almost everything you can say about Roosevelt on the one hand, you can also say the direct opposite. He's this great idealist, and yet he's also an utter cynic. He is seemingly open and charming, and yet he can also be cold and devious. He is the best friend that embattled Britain ever had, and yet he's absolutely determined to dismantle the British Empire and treats Churchill pretty poorly at various points in the war. I think the point about Stalin is that both Roosevelt and Churchill at various times underestimate him, as indeed the British and the Americans might do in general. They look at him and consider him a uneducated, backward revolutionary who's not had their sorts of education in world affairs and diplomacy, and that by courting him, by developing personal bonds with him, they will be able to influence him. And this is completely fallacious, sadly. But at the same time, the Americans do not really see, and Roosevelt in particular, does not really see the Soviet Union as a major threat. Although Roosevelt is determined that the United States will not retreat into isolationism in 1945, as she had in 1918, 1919, he is nevertheless much more relaxed about the balance of power in Europe vis-à-vis the Soviets than the British are, for obvious reasons of geography. The British are much more concerned about the balance of power in Europe. And therefore, the sense that the Soviet Union could ever be a major threat to American interests does not really exist. But at the same time, there is this naivety about Stalin and Stalin's ideology. There is a growing sense during the Second World War that Stalin has stopped being the terrifying communist revolutionary and has just become a Russian nationalist. And Roosevelt buys the line, a line which will seem very familiar to listeners today, that all Stalin is really after is security for his people and his country. He is not after empire building, as it were. Churchill occasionally goes along with this line too, but it is the former US ambassador to Moscow, the first US ambassador to the Soviet Union, because America didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933, William C. Bullitt, who writes this masterly and very clear-sighted memorandum to FDR in 1943, arguing that, firstly, Stalin hasn't just become a Russian nationalist. He is very much still a communist and looks forward to the, as he sees it, inevitable destruction of the capitalist system in the West, but also that being a mere Russian nationalist is not something to be sanguine about. The Russian nationalist state, Bullitt argues, was never pacific. It was always aggressive. He points out that textbooks for school children in the Soviet Union are printed in over 150 different languages. The Soviet Union is an empire. These people, these Kazakhs, these Uzbeks, these Ukrainians, these Baltic peoples, these Chechens, I could go on, have all been conquered one after the other by the Russian nationalist state. And he concludes by saying, so even if Stalin had become a, quote, mere Russian nationalist, that would be no guarantee of pacific behavior. It would, on the contrary, be a guarantee of aggressive imperialism.
It was really interesting to see Roosevelt kind of buy that line. And again, I know you've written a few articles over the past couple of weeks drawing out the parallels between this time and today. But then when you were mentioning balance of power and those percentages that you mentioned within the book, how does Churchill, as you said, he's a little bit more aware of the situation in Europe. How does Churchill try and combat and deal with that future with Stalin?
The war was to a large extent being won on the Eastern Front. 75% of German combat fatalities occurred on the Eastern Front. And Churchill starts to get increasingly concerned about the progress of the Red Army through 1943 and 1944 into 1945, realizing, despite the fact that he actually did have fantasies about using British and American tanks and German manpower to drive the Soviets back to their so-called natural frontiers, he realizes really that there's nothing the British and the Americans can do to get the Soviets out of Eastern and Central Europe once they're there. So he thinks that he dedicates himself to trying to save as much of Eastern Central Europe, the Balkans, from communism, from Soviet domination as he can. He recognizes that at least Eastern Poland has gone, and he doesn't try and bargain with Stalin about that. He says, on the other hand, he tries to use Eastern Poland as a way of saying, well, if we allow you to move the Soviet frontier this far west, and we compensate the Poles with land in what was formerly East Prussia, what we want for you is that this Polish state really will be truly independent, free, democratic. Similarly, he sees that Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia being increasingly dominated by the communist partisans under Josip Broz, better known as Tito, who've actually been supplied by the British. He sees that there's very little Britain and indeed the United States can do in this part of the world. But Greece has not yet been invaded by the Red Army. Greece is and always has been considered integral to Britain's strategic position within the Mediterranean, Suez Canal not far south, the passage through the Dardanelles, which Churchill's always had a keen interest in, into the Black Sea. And so when he goes to Moscow in October of 1944, his mission is to try and save Greece and try and preserve some element of British influence in the Balkans. And although this document is fairly ridiculous, whereby Churchill and Stalin divide up the Balkans on a percentage basis of influence, as the American Soviet expert Chip Bolin later wrote, to divide up a country on a percentage basis is almost like to say that a woman can be 50% pregnant. You either are or you aren't. But by seeming to make this deal, and this is the sort of deal that Stalin liked. Let's remember, this is the sort of deal that Stalin made with Hitler in 1939, August of 1939. It does seem that Churchill is able to keep the Soviets out of Greece. And when a potential or a putative communist uprising occurs in Greece in the winter of 1944 to 1945, the Red Army does nothing. The Moscow newspapers do not support the communists in Greece. Stalin really doesn't lift a finger to aid his ideological allies in the Balkans in this sphere, and Churchill is grateful to him.
It's really, I think it's a testament to Stalin's, not trying to give positive praise to Stalin at all, but a testament to, his politicking, that he was not lifting a finger in that realm in Greece for those communist uprisings. But then, within these discussions as well, there's still this idea of what do we do with Germany? Because a lot of this is post-war planning, spheres of influence, but there is still the immediate issue of what do you do with German officials and the German people after the war? How do the three work together to kind of come up with a solution?
Well, they have very different ideas. It's at the Tehran conference that Stalin says that he would like to shoot 50,000 German officers at the end of the war, quite summarily, regardless of whether they have been even deemed to be guilty of war crimes or not. Just 50,000 will be rounded up and shot. And later on, he claimed in that evening that he was joking, but I think we know Stalin's record in the Soviet Union. I don't think he was joking. Roosevelt tries to lighten the tension by saying, well, 50,000 might be too many. What about 49,000? But actually, one of the things I showed in my book is that this is often portrayed as just an attempt at humor to ease the Allies out of a difficult period of conversation. But both Roosevelt and his otherwise extremely moral, upright, internationalist New Deal Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, both of them have discussed and been on record as telling British officials how they would like to just see the leading Nazis and members of the Japanese governments, those that they consider responsible for the war, just shot without any trial. And it's the British who are insisting that there must be magnanimity in victory, there must be justice in victory. The Americans go along also with the Soviet idea that Germany must be completely destroyed. It is Henry Morgenthau Jr., the US Treasury Secretary, who comes up with this really radical, dramatic, almost biblical plan to turn Germany, this most industrial nation in Europe, into a pastoral state. He thinks that the Germans can never be changed, that it is in their nature to be efficient, to make the instruments of war and then to make war. And the only way to stop them doing that is to take away all those instruments. And Churchill is horrified by this. He later goes along with it very briefly before again recanting. That's purely because the Americans are effectively blackmailing him over continued supplies of Lend-Lease. But there is a unity between the Americans and the Soviets in wanting Germany treated as harshly as possible. The British have a different perspective. They realize that the reparations which were demanded by the Allies at the end of the First World War were unrealistic. They weren't paid. There ended up being this ridiculous system whereby the British and the French, in the time after the First World War, in the 20s and the 30s, the British and the French owed the Americans lots of money in loans from the First World War. And the British and the French said, well, we can't pay that back because we need the money from Germany. We need all these reparations because we've been so financially damaged by this war. And the Americans, and then the Germans say that they can't pay these reparations. So the Americans give loans to the Germans, allowing the Germans to pay some of the reparations to the British and the French, allowing the British and the French to pay some of their loans back to Germany. So there's a whole crazy system of everyone loaning each other money. And that all falls down like a pack of cards when the Wall Street crash occurs and the Americans withdraw their loans, the British and the French withdraw their loans. Nobody can pay anything. So the British have a strong sense that reparations, too stringent reparations, do not work, and they merely fuel the desire for revenge in a country, as indeed happened in Germany in the 20s and the 30s. They also, I think, increasingly aware by the time of Yalta that Germany is not going to pose a major threat to the world for a considerable period of time, and that the new threat to the balance of power in Europe and the new potentially imperial power in Europe is the Soviet Union. And so to have some sort of functioning, economically self-sufficient, possibly even thriving German state under Western or Allied supervision becomes a major objective of Churchill and the British delegation at Yalta, and then again at Potsdam.
And at those last couple of conferences, Stalin is probably at his pomp, incredibly diplomatic, incredibly powerful. But on the flip side, you've got a Churchill that's perhaps not as strong as he was earlier in these negotiations, and an ailing Roosevelt. How do they deal with Stalin and his demands at these last couple of conferences?
Well, if we just take Yalta, which I really think is the last of the wartime conferences, I don't deal with Potsdam in any detail in my book because I think that really belongs to the post-war world. There are certain things that all of the Allies want, and they did get a certain number of victories. The British wanted to give the French a zone of occupation in the new Germany, and the British got that. Roosevelt wanted the Soviets to promise that they would join the war against Japan after the defeat of Germany, and Roosevelt got that promise. Roosevelt also wanted the Soviets to fully sign up to the United Nations, which he was filling. I mean, he was forming at the time. It was very clear that one of the reasons the League of Nations had failed was because one of the major powers in those days, not just the Soviet Union at the beginning, but throughout all time, the United States, had not participated in it. And for that, they made major concessions. Roosevelt promised Stalin territory in the Far East, some territory of which was not even Japanese, it was Chinese, and he did this without consulting the Allies' Far Eastern ally, Nationalist China and Chiang Kai-shek. At the same time, Roosevelt went along with Stalin's demands to treat Germany harshly and for reparations. Churchill battled very hard to save Poland in particular. Poland was the most important of the Eastern European countries for political and sentimental reasons to the British, because it was for Poland that Britain had at least nominally gone to war in 1939. He and Roosevelt, their tactic, however, is not terribly successful. It is to appeal to Stalin on emotional and democratic grounds. The Poles must be masters in their own house, says Churchill. You must understand we fought for Poland. British public opinion, American public opinion won't understand if the Poles are betrayed at this late stage. These are not the sort of appeals that are likely to have a great resonance with a man like Joseph Stalin. And yet, it is very hard to see what either the British or the Americans could have done at Yalta to stop the Soviets from dominating Poland and Eastern Europe. This was a consistent war aim of Stalin's from the very beginning. The time that Stalin first demands the British recognize the Soviet Union's frontiers as they existed in the summer of 1941, before the German invasion, was in December of 1941, when the Wehrmacht was on the doorstep of Moscow. He is thinking so far ahead, and it just shows how important it is. He wants the British to acquiesce to the annexation of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, this eastern part of Romania. And the British refused then, but by February of 1945, at the Yalta Conference, the Red Army is in possession of all of this territory. And although, as I've said, Churchill in May of 1945 fantasizes about an idea of a British and American crusade to push the Soviets out of Eastern Europe, the code name that is given to this operation is quite rightly unthinkable. It was utterly unthinkable to suddenly change enemies and begin a new, equally, if not more, existential war against the Soviet Union, while the smoke from the last conflict hadn't even cleared in the air.
And I think that just comes to show, that the differences between power in a democratic regime and power in a totalitarian regime such as Stalin's. So I think now is actually quite a nice point to ask you a final fun question, Tim, as we do for every guest here on the podcast. You've written a book on classical music before, but I wanted to ask you, what is your favourite piece of classical music and why?
This is the question you ask everyone what their favourite piece of classical music is.
Unfortunately, not that same question.
Oh my God, I cannot possibly think of what my favourite piece of classical music is, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, Mozart's Don Giovanni.
Okay, I think that's a really lovely, and I think Mozart's a very good choice there. So thank you. Now, obviously, we have touched on a tiny fraction of some of the history that you look at in Allies at War. So where can people get a copy of your book?
As the saying goes, all good bookshops, on Amazon, online, wherever you like. Yes, as you say, we've touched on a fraction. It's a book which tries to look at Allied politics in its entirety. So that starts with the French and then obviously includes everything that the British and the Americans and the Soviets did, but that also includes the Chinese in the Far East, the relations with the Yugoslav partisans, British intervention in Greece, these wars against Vichy. It's trying to be as comprehensive as it can without being heavy for people to have to read and carry on their holidays.
Well, I totally recommend people going to get a copy and learn about the areas that we haven't touched on as well. So then, if people want to keep up to date with you and your work, where can they go?
Well, they can find me on social media. I'm on Twitter, or as it's now called, X, and I have an open account on Instagram. But then I will also be speaking at lots of literary festivals, foremost among them the Chalke History Festival, where I will be speaking on Saturday, the 28th of June at 12 p.m. So it'd be great to see as many people there as possible.
Well, fantastic. I mean, I'm looking forward to that talk. So thank you very much for coming on, Tim.
Thank you, Jackson. It's been a great pleasure.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1.